The night of the impossible crime. The rain had been falling for hours. A cold autumn wind moved through the empty streets of Blackwood Village, a small and forgotten town surrounded by endless forests. The old houses stood silently beneath the dark sky, their windows glowing like distant eyes watching the world outside. It was the kind of night when people locked their doors early, turned off their lights, and avoided walking alone. But inside the grand mansion at the edge of the village, something terrible was about to happen. A murder. A murder that would become known as the most impossible crime in the history of Blackwood, because the victim was found dead inside a room that no one could enter and no one could leave. The mansion belonged to Edward Whitmore, a wealthy businessman known throughout the region. Edward was a man of great success, but also a man surrounded by rumors. Some people admired him for building his fortune from nothing. Others whispered that his success came at a terrible price. He was a man who collected secrets, and in a small town like Blackwood, secrets were dangerous. The Whitmore mansion had stood on the hill for almost a century. Its stone walls, dark wooden halls, and endless corridors made it look more like a castle than a home. On that particular evening, Edward had invited several guests for a private dinner. Among them were people closest to him: Richard Whitmore, his younger brother, who had recently returned after many years away; Clara Whitmore, Edward's niece, the only family member he truly trusted; Thomas Reed, his old business partner; and Dr. Henry Collins, the family physician and longtime friend. At first, the evening seemed ordinary. The guests sat around the large dining table beneath the glow of candlelight. They spoke about business, memories, and the changing world outside. But those who knew Edward well noticed something unusual. He seemed nervous. He checked the grandfather clock repeatedly. He looked toward the hallway every few minutes. And several times, he reached into his jacket pocket to touch something hidden inside. A small envelope. At exactly 10:30 in the evening, Edward stood from his chair. "I apologize," he said quietly. "There is a matter I must attend to before the night ends." His guests looked at him with curiosity. "Business?" Thomas Reed asked. Edward smiled faintly. "Something much older than business." He picked up a small key from the table and walked toward the second floor. Nobody knew that those would be the last words they would ever hear from him. Edward's private study was located at the end of the eastern hallway. It was the most protected room in the mansion. The walls were covered with old books, expensive paintings, and rare antiques. But the most important thing about the study was its door. A heavy wooden door with a special lock. Edward trusted no one with his private documents. No servant was allowed inside. No guest. Not even family members. When Edward entered the room, everyone downstairs heard the sound of the lock turning. Click. The door was locked from the inside. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The guests continued waiting. At first, nobody was worried. Edward was known for disappearing into his study for hours. But then Clara noticed something strange. The fire in the fireplace had started to die. The candles in the hallway outside the study were burning low, and Edward had not answered any calls. "Perhaps he fell asleep," Richard suggested, but Clara shook her head. "My uncle never sleeps at his desk." Something felt wrong. Thomas Reed approached the study door and knocked. "Edward?" No answer. He knocked again, louder. "Edward, are you there?" Silence. The four guests exchanged nervous looks. Dr. Collins stepped forward, opened the door. Richard tried the handle. It did not move. The door was locked from the inside. They called Edward's name again. Nothing. Then they noticed something else. The key was not outside. It was inside the lock, on the other side. A feeling of fear filled the hallway, because everyone knew what that meant. Edward Whitmore was alone inside. The door was locked. The windows were sealed, and there was no other entrance. Yet something terrible had happened. After several minutes of panic, they had no choice. They broke down the door. The heavy wooden frame finally gave way, crashing into the room. And what they saw inside stopped them completely. Edward Whitmore was lying beside his desk, motionless, dead. A single candle flickered beside him. The fireplace was still burning. The room was untouched. Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing appeared disturbed. But on the desk was one strange object, a small piece of paper. On it were only 4 words: "The truth will return." The police arrived shortly after midnight. Leading the investigation was a famous detective from London, Detective Arthur Blackwell, a man known for solving cases that others considered impossible. When he entered the study, he did not immediately look at the body. He looked at the room, the door, the windows, the fireplace, the desk, every small detail. The officers expected him to be shocked by the impossible situation. Instead, he calmly removed his gloves and said, "Interesting." One officer looked confused. "Interesting, sir. A man has been murdered inside a locked room." Arthur Blackwell looked around the study. "No," he replied. "A man has been murdered inside a room that only appears to be locked." The detective walked toward the desk and examined the mysterious message. The killer wanted us to believe this was impossible. He placed the paper down. And whenever someone wants you to believe something is impossible, he paused. That is usually where the truth begins. The Locked Room Investigation. The morning after Edward Whitmore's death, Blackwood Village woke beneath a heavy silence. News of the murder had already spread. People stood outside the mansion gates, whispering among themselves. Some said it was revenge. Others believed it was a family betrayal. And a few believed something much darker had happened inside the old mansion on the hill. But inside the study, Detective Arthur Blackwell remained completely focused. To everyone else, the room was a mystery. To him, it was a message. Every object had a story. Every detail had a purpose. And somewhere inside that room was the answer. Arthur slowly walked around the study. The officers had already searched the area, but the detective knew that the first moments of an investigation were often filled with mistakes. People searched for what they expected to find. A great detective searched for what others ignored. He looked at the broken door. The door was forced open from the outside, one officer explained. Arthur nodded. Yes, but before it was broken, it was locked. The officer pointed toward the key. The key was found inside the lock. Arthur looked carefully at it. Was it exactly as you found it? Yes, sir. The detective leaned closer. Interesting. He did not touch the key. Instead, he looked at the floor beneath it. A small scratch appeared near the bottom of the door. Almost invisible. Almost meaningless. But Arthur noticed it. Everyone believes the important question is how the killer escaped, Arthur said. The officer nodded. That is the impossible part. No, Arthur replied. The impossible part is why everyone is so certain the killer escaped at all. The room became silent. Arthur moved toward the windows. There were 2 large windows facing the forest. Both were closed. Both were locked. Outside, rain had fallen throughout the night. The ground beneath the windows was covered with wet soil. If someone climbed through these windows, the detective said, there would be footprints. The officers looked outside. There were none. The windows had not been opened. The fireplace was examined next. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, but Arthur noticed something strange. The ashes inside the fireplace were disturbed. Was the fire like this when you entered? He asked. The officer shook his head. We didn't pay attention. Arthur smiled slightly. People rarely pay attention to the things they believe are ordinary. The detective picked up a small piece of burned paper from the ashes. Only a few words remained visible. The account. The missing documents. Arthur's expression changed. He carefully placed the fragment into an evidence bag. So, he whispered, the secret begins. The suspects. By noon, Arthur Blackwell gathered everyone who had been in the mansion that night. Richard Whitmore, Clara Whitmore, Thomas Reed, and Dr. Henry Collins. 4 people, 4 possible motives, 4 people who had reasons to want Edward Whitmore gone. Richard Whitmore, Edward's younger brother, appeared calm, but Arthur noticed the tension in his eyes. You returned to Blackwood after many years, the detective said. Yes. Why? Richard looked away. Family reasons? Arthur opened a folder. Interesting, because according to these documents, you returned 3 days before your brother changed his will. The room became quiet. Richard's face hardened. My brother and I had disagreements. That doesn't mean I killed him. Arthur studied him carefully. Perhaps not. Then he added, but disagreements often reveal secrets. The truth behind the impossible murder. The rain continued to fall over Blackwood Village. The old Whitmore mansion stood silently on the hill, hiding decades of secrets within its stone walls. But inside the study, Detective Arthur Blackwell finally understood something important. The murder of Edward Whitmore was never meant to be a perfect crime. It was meant to be a performance. The killer wanted everyone to believe they had witnessed something impossible, a murder committed by someone who could enter a locked room and disappear without a trace. But Arthur knew one thing. There is no such thing as an impossible crime, only a crime that has not yet been understood. The next morning, Arthur gathered everyone in the mansion's great hall. Richard Whitmore. All 4 stood silently as the detective entered. The time has come, Arthur said, to reveal what happened inside Edward Whitmore's study. Everyone waited. The answer was never outside the room. He paused. It was inside the room all along. The secret behind the locked door. Arthur walked toward the study. The first mistake everyone made was believing the killer escaped after the murder. He looked at the group. But what if the killer never escaped? The room became silent. Richard frowned. "What are you saying?" Arthur continued. Edward Whitmore was not killed by someone who entered his study. He pointed toward the locked door. He was killed by someone who was already allowed to be there. The detective explained his discovery. The murderer did not need to break into the room. We only needed Edward's trust. The killer entered before the door was locked. They waited. They committed the crime. And then they created the illusion of an impossible murder. The locked room was not protecting Edward from the killer. It was protecting the killer from suspicion. Arthur turned toward the fireplace. The most important clue was the fire. Everyone looked confused. The killer burned a document in this fireplace. He held up the evidence bag containing the burned paper. The missing documents were the real reason behind this murder. 20 years earlier, Edward Whitmore and Thomas Reed had been involved in a business agreement. But something went wrong. A large amount of company money disappeared. The blame fell on a young employee named William Carter. William was accused of stealing the money. He disappeared shortly afterward. Everyone believed he had run away, but the truth was different. William Carter had been innocent. The person responsible was someone much closer to Edward, someone who had manipulated the evidence, someone who had allowed an innocent man to carry the blame. Arthur looked directly at Thomas Reed. The stolen money was never taken by William Carter. Thomas's expression changed. "It was taken by you." The room froze. Thomas shook his head. "You have no proof." Arthur calmly reached into his pocket. "I do." He placed Edward's letter on the table. Edward discovered the truth years later. Edward's final discovery. Edward had spent years searching for answers. He discovered that Thomas Reed had secretly transferred company money into hidden accounts. When Edward confronted him, Thomas feared everything would be exposed. But Edward had made another discovery. William Carter had not disappeared. He had died years ago, carrying the shame of a crime he never committed. Edward felt responsible. He planned to reveal the truth. And that was the reason he had to die. Thomas stepped backward. "This is impossible." Arthur looked at him. "No, Mr. Reed." He smiled slightly. The impossible part was only a trick. How the murder was done. Arthur explained the final piece of the puzzle. Thomas arrived at Edward's study before dinner ended. Edward trusted him. They spoke privately. During their conversation, Thomas discovered that Edward had prepared evidence against him. A confrontation followed. In anger and fear, Thomas attacked Edward. After the murder, he realized the problem. Everyone knew Edward was alone in the locked study. So, Thomas created the illusion. He locked the door from the outside, using a thin wire hidden through the small gap beneath the door. The wire was then pulled away, leaving the key inside the lock. The scratch near the door was the clue Arthur had noticed, a small mark left by the wire. The impossible room was simply a carefully created deception. The final revelation. Thomas Reed lowered his head. For years, he had believed money could hide the truth. But secrets have a way of returning. Just as Edward wrote, the truth will return. The police arrested Thomas Reed that evening. The name of William Carter was finally cleared. And the Whitmore mansion, once filled with whispers and suspicion, became a symbol of a mystery finally solved. Years later, many years passed, Detective Arthur Blackwell was asked about the famous locked room case. A young journalist asked him, "What was the most difficult part of solving the Whitmore murder?" The detective smiled. "The difficult part was not finding the killer." The journalist looked surprised. "Then what was it?" Arthur looked out the window at the dark streets below, understanding why people create illusions. He paused. A locked door can hide a crime, but it can never hide the truth forever. And so the mystery of the Whitmore mansion became one of the greatest detective stories ever told. A reminder that every secret leaves a trace, every lie creates a shadow, and every mystery, no matter how impossible it seems, has an answer waiting in the darkness.